Well, hello, friends. What a gift to follow friends Sandra and Jim in terms of being here with you. And what a gift to be a conversation partner with your bishop. One of the joys of my life and my work is that I do get a chance to talk with a lot of our leaders from across the connection. And I don't think that I know of any other section of the church beyond the South Central jurisdiction that has strength of leadership and courage of leadership as much as we do here. But part of what I want to talk about today is that our United Methodist Church is healthier than any other time that I have known it. And we have much work to do. It goes both ways. We have come on a long, long path. And it's a path that your bishops and I have been talking about for quite some time. It's a path that you and I know. But in order for us to take the next steps into the future, in order for us to understand the perspective, and what we're going to come back to is the fact that when your candidates for ministry were here, your bishop turned to them and said, "How would you explain your faith to someone 18 years old or younger?" That's something I don't know how to do. But yet if our church doesn't learn how to do that, we will not continue to be the church, the United Methodist Church, that will reflect the Wesleyan movement that started us. And so we are healthier than I have ever known, and don't forget, a man my age knows an awful lot in terms of the years, but we have an awful lot more work to do. So, if you will, what I'd like to do is I'd like to begin with two stories, and these are two stories that we've been enjoying at Texas Methodist Foundation. Bishop, these are stories I told at the last board meeting, and they kind of will take us someplace, I hope, as we go a little bit further this afternoon. The first comes from Louisiana. Now, one of the things that your bishop said is that I work with the district superintendents from the South Central jurisdiction, and we have been in conversation for a number of years, and I have heard delightful stories, but none such as this. Van Stinson, one of the district superintendents, came and he said, "Gil, not too long ago I got a call on Saturday night, and it was a church that needed to let me know that their pastor had just been arrested. And he had been arrested for purchasing illegal prescription drugs from Canada, and as I understand it, he did not know it was illegal, but yet it had still happened." And so Van said, "I had to go the next morning." Now, when a district superintendent goes to a church the next morning, they know that they are going to face some anxious people. And in that anxiety, sometimes people say things that they might not say at other times. Now, if you need me to explain that, we can take a little bit of time here. Van was surprised because the group he met was relatively calm. He was, in fact, a little bit befuddled until one man stood up, and Van described him as formidable. And he said, "Reverend, we're going to be okay. For whom among us has not been arrested?" My second story is about my friend Jeremy. Jeremy is a young man. He's about the same age as my youngest son. Jeremy was, in fact, a child in the last church I served in Reading, Pennsylvania. Being the same age as my children, I can assure you that Jeremy is the reason that my two boys were in trouble in church. Literally. But since high school, Jeremy has taken a different path than my two boys. And so as we visit now, I am sitting down with someone who is a stained glass artist. I'm sitting down with someone who is an accomplished musician, not just a practitioner, but a composer, a writer, and has begun to produce CDs. I am sitting down with a martial arts expert. And I am sitting down with a skateboarder to the extent that when I asked him to move some furniture not too long ago, he said, "Gil, I'd love to, but it still hurts." Jeremy looks different from my two boys. I've started to say that Jeremy looks a lot like Jesus would look if Jesus wanted to look like Jesus. How many of you remember the old Solomon picture of Jesus? Jeremy looks like the Solomon picture of Jesus with the addition of a Duck Dynasty beard. And he has tattoos. I'm talking bold tattoos. And when we have coffee and when he's wearing all of his piercings, people look at me wondering what I'm doing. And Jeremy is completing his first year of seminary. Now, in his first year of seminary, his field education project is to start a new faith community in one of our smaller urban centers in Pennsylvania. And at the end of his first year, he has been voted, by however they do it at his seminary, as the most promising bivocational pastor and the student with greatest academic excellence. That's Jeremy. So, what I'd like to do is to simply suggest that those two stories, if all goes well today, will come in handy later. So if you would, just hold them for a time being, because what we need to do is we need to recapture a little bit of the path that we have been through that brings us to the point that these two stories might be important for us today. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of homework to try to make sense of it. And we need first to talk about the time that we came from in which our churches were favored. Because you see, I came from a time in which the United Methodist Church was strong. I came from a time when the United Methodist Church was growing. I came from a time, and right now in my city of Philadelphia, when I go back home, we have about 20 full-time pastors working in the city of Philadelphia in full-time appointments. And when I was growing up, there were a bit more than 80. I came from a time in which the church was strong. I have lived through a time in which the church has not been strong. We lived in a time in which the church was strong simply because we were in a time of exponential growth that came out of the World War experience. Now, we need to be careful here when we're talking about any of this to remember that whenever we start to talk about numbers, and whenever we start to talk about figures, the United States has always been and continues to be the most religious developed nation on the globe. The reports are always that there's about 40% of our population that identify themselves in some way to a faith tradition and a faith practice. When people begin to work with those figures and they begin to talk about average attendance, and depending upon how you feel about average attendance, that 40% might become only 20% that regularly practice their faith in any way within a local church, within a congregation, within a synagogue. But the fact is that we are still the most religious developed nation on the globe when you begin to compare us with other developed nations, which often are reporting 2% or 5% of the people who are connected to faith traditions. But a lot of our strength came out of that experience that came after the Second World War, when we were in a time of great growth, both economically and also religiously. Our forebears that came out of that war came from a time in which joining was essential. You had to belong. These were people who formed a group identity. These were the people who knew how to serve on teams together. These were people who knew how to work together, how to commit together, how to even win a world war together. And so joining was, in fact, part of their normative practice. And so when they came back from the war, the joining increased in our congregations. Membership meant a lot. It was a time of loyalty. People who had understood through sacrifice the importance of being loyal and picking up your fair share. These were people that were easy to talk to about stewardship. Because stewardship essentially said, am I paying my fair share? Am I paying as much as other people to care for something that is important to me? Not only in terms of my dollars, but my time, my support for committees, for programs, wherever you want to go. And these were people who were deeply loyal. It's only been recently that I've picked up on one of the nuances that helped me to understand that when people came back from a Second World War, they had completed a war only to be faced then with a Cold War. And the enemy of a Cold War, they were told, were communists. But not just communists, godless communists. And if you've won a Second World War, and if you are part of the group that has done that, if you are loyal, if you are faithful, and if you want to preserve your way of life, and you're facing a godless enemy, where do you go? You go to church. So friends, part of what I'm suggesting is that I came from a time in which the culture pushed people toward the church. That didn't mean that the people in the church weren't working hard. We are standing on the shoulders of people who worked hard and who did remarkably good work, but at the same time, it was the culture that pushed people toward the church. In order for you to know who you were, you had to know where you belonged. That's how you shaped your identity. In order to know where you fit into the community, you had to know where you went to fit into the community, and you pointed to your church. I often joke there was a time when it was not permissible to wake up and not be a member of a church. Now, you didn't always have to go to that church, but you had to be able to say, that's my church. And so it was a way in which people attested to their values. And so I came from a very, very strong church. But then beginning in 1965, and 1965 was a critical year. 1965, Bishop, is when I graduated from high school. I know. I didn't want to mention your name, but I thought I would offer my own. Sam, the Sham, and the Pharaohs, and Wooly Bully. See? Okay, now if you're raising your hand because you recognize this, let me point out you are much too old. 1965, 50 years ago, is the first year that the United Methodist Church posted a net decrease in our membership. So in order to get back to our two stories, what I'd like to do is I would like to rehearse where we have been, and more importantly, what we've been learning over that 50 years that brings us to the point that we now understand much more about what it means to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land, because it is the foreign land that has come around us. We need to talk about how we've been wandering in the wilderness since 1965 and what we've been learning. And so what I've offered here is just a kind of an overview, not only in terms of some of the things that you and I remember, but what some of our reactions were to it at the same time. So if we talk about 1965 and those immediate years after, let's say for the next 5 years, 7 years, basically what was happening is that we were beginning to lose membership, net membership as a denomination, and it spawned a lot of curiosity, just like global warming does for us today. People look at the data and then they begin to say, is it real or is it not real? Is it a trend? Is it not a trend? Is it reversible? Is it a natural cycle? What is happening? And so for those first years, I can imagine that what our denominational leaders were doing were simply asking themselves, what is it that we're looking at? And we waited for a period of time until we realized this is not correcting itself. By 1972, we moved into a time in which we prepared ourselves for an evangelical effort. It was the first time in contemporary modern history in which the mainline and the evangelical church came together to present Christ to the whole country. It was known as Key 73. Any of you old enough to remember Key 73? If you did Sam and the Sham and the Pharaohs, you should get this one. We printed more Bibles and more books of the Bible to be handed out to remind people and to introduce them to Christ than at any other time in modern North American history. What we were trying to do was fix something that we were beginning to feel was broken. So we had moved from curiosity to wanting to fix things. And that got us into the church growth movement. Now, you and I are still standing on the shoulders of the hard work that was done by the first people who were figuring out church growth. And what we were learning at that time is that as an institution, if we wanted new people to come into our churches, what we had to do first is remove passive barriers. We had to take away those things that keep people out. And so curiously, clergy were learning about parking spaces. That it takes at least one parking space for every 2.4 people in your congregation if in fact you're going to welcome new people into the church. And suddenly we saw clergy out in the parking lot counting spaces. And then we began to learn through this kind of homework that people were doing for us that once your congregation is 80% physically filled, it is 100% psychologically filled for anybody else. And so suddenly clergy were measuring pews, and the great debates were whether or not people needed 18, 24, or 36 inches to sit down. And we learn things that are curious that, from this perspective, that we even had to learn. Such as, if you really do want young families with children to come, it really is a good idea to tell them where the nursery is. I once did a consultation in a Presbyterian church. You'll find that all my horror stories come from other denominations besides United Methodist. I did a consultation one time with a Presbyterian church that didn't understand why no one would visit them, and I suggested that perhaps on Sunday morning it would be good to unlock the front door. Because you see, if you're only including the people who already know everything about you and how to be with you, and if they all come in the back door, it never dawns on you that to welcome others, you might have to remove some barriers. And so we were doing a lot of learning there. Now, one of the things that we're going to learn quickly is all the learn we were doing during those times was in fact not producing yet the results that we wanted. But that was fine, because what we were doing is that we were learning, and every time we learned, it took us on to more questions and better questions and, quite frankly, more difficult questions. But what we decided after a while is that perhaps this is not as fixable as we thought, and if it's not as fixable as we thought, then it must be somebody's fault. You know, the old adage that when you don't know what went wrong, you want to know who went wrong. And so we began to blame our clergy and our congregations. And we set off on a few years of concentrating on fixing our clergy, fixing our churches. There were a time in which clergy had to post continuing education units, CEUs, to demonstrate that they had spent a certain number of hours. We had programs of congregational development, strategic planning. There was a day in which a church could not wake up without a mission statement. And so they set about making mission statements, whether people understood them or not. Friends, may I suggest that I came from a time in which the culture was pushing people toward the church. And I, like a lot of you, were living now in a culture that was pushing people away from the church. That this was a much deeper issue than just the way we were practicing our own community life together. This really had to do with a culture that was giving people a lot of different answers and a lot of different alternatives in a time of great economic expansion when people's anxieties are the lowest and in which they seek Christ the least. Identity no longer came from joining. Identity now came from individuals making their own choices. Church was not something you did as a way of moving quietly into community with others because life now was much too frenetic. We began to pay attention to what we knew as the margin of life. The margin of life is that part of our lives that's left over after we have fulfilled those obligations that we are committed to, such as family and such as work. There used to be large sections of this margin of life. Today, it is very, very minimal. I loved learning the fact that every single labor-saving device over the last 100 years has increased the work week. Because whenever we are given a moment that is not structured, we do not use it to seek out meaning and purpose. We use it to increase our productivity. How many of you are already beginning to look for your emails to see if you missed anything while Rendle was talking? And all of that pushes us away from that quiet spot in which we ask the questions of meaning. And so what was happening is this frenetic world in which we lived that was no longer pushing people toward the church was now pushing people away. And so the learning continued. And so if we go with that, we can move on to 1996. 1996 was when we developed our new mission statement. The mission of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. May I suggest that this was a major step for us? Because in our pilgrimage in the wilderness, this was us saying, it is not a fixable situation. It is not something that we can correct by fixing our clergy, our congregations, or any of our practices. That this is, in fact, the time for us to go back to ask again, who are we as United Methodists? What is our identity? What is our purpose? We were going back to the beginning to frame again what we believed we were called to. And in your Texas conference, you have been trying to live out that new mission statement from that point on. By the time we got to 2007, we had taken another step. This is not only about trying to frame our identity and our purpose. This is us committing ourselves to learning new ways. In 2007, your bishop was president of the Council of Bishops. There was a global gathering. It was the first gathering in 40 years in which the United Methodist Church brought all of its leaders from across the globe into one place to have a conversation about who we are and what we do. And it was a remarkable 3 days in Lake Junaluska. And what was really stunning is at the end of the 3 days, the Council of Bishops didn't say anything at all to people about here's what you should do when you go home. Instead, what the Council of Bishops said was, if you understand our identity and our purpose, would you please go home and learn how to do it yourselves? Because we were finally recognizing that no one can tell me, no one can tell you how to be a Wesleyan Christian in a foreign land. We were learning. We were learning. And so it continued into the call of action in 2011, into the General Conference of 2012, in which we struggled with accountability. Let me try to push this ahead a little bit, friends, because by 2011, one of the things I realized is I was working with groups, I began to talk about gap theory. And gap theory is an organizational issue. It's an organizational construct that helps us to understand a little bit about where we are when we begin to look into the future. Now here, what you have in the gap theory is you start with the present state. This is the way we tend to think about ourselves whenever we think about our future, whenever we begin to do planning. We are a linear people. We think from left to right. And so what we do is we start over on the left side and we say, this is the way we are today. And then we say, how will we now be in the future? And we tend to draw a very straight linear line with the assumption that the future is probably going to look something like we look today. How many of you remember going into your church basement on a Saturday afternoon or a Saturday morning for strategic planning for the next year? And you asked the question, now that we've done everything we did this year, what do you want to do next year? And so you got out the newsprint and you came up with 694 new things that you could do next year. Do you remember that? And you couldn't do them all, so then everybody got a chance to check off the 3 that they liked the best. Because the assumption that was driving that was at the end of next year, we will look very much like we did this year, but having done a few more things. How are we doing? We making sense so far? And those that have you been with me know that when I ask that question, the answer is yes. Well, the reality is that is not our future in the United Methodist Church. By paying attention to our data, which was part of the recommendation that came out of our call to action and the Towers and Watson report that was part of the study of our United Methodist Church, we began to pay attention to the fact that all of our numbers for money were going up, all of our numbers for people were going down, and the disparity in age between a United Methodist and an American was growing larger and larger. The average age of a United Methodist at that time was 57 years old. The average age of a person living in the United States was 35. And so it brought us to that formula that for the moment, we are now living off more and more money from fewer and fewer people who are getting older and older. That is not a sustainable position. We can't assume that we can continue to do that. And so our future is not that linear line, it's the one that drops. And so we had to begin to talk about a preferred future. And the preferred future is the one in which we began to say, no, truly, who we are is a people who make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Ours is not one in which we're simply going to be churches as we've always been. We will make disciples. Now, a disciple is a person with a changed lives. We will change lives, and through the lives of people who have been changed, we will change the world in which we live. How are we doing? The reality is, when you begin to think about institutional organizational gap theory, it confronts you with the reality that quite often you can't get there from here. You can't start from an unsustainable position and suddenly make disciples and transform the world. It's too big of a leap. Now, I've shared a lot of this over a period of time with a number of my friends, and they sometimes say, well, Gil, it's time to move on. Especially when we get to this point where I say one of the reasons we can't make the leap is because even today we are still trying to make disciples in congregations that do not practice discipleship. Might I suggest you can't get there from here? There are things that we still have to learn, things that we still have to do in order to continue this pilgrimage in the wilderness. And so we began to learn about proximate outcomes. If we can't right away make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, there have to be some steps along the way that you and I are willing to work at. And so you can see some that are up here. Now, the denomination immediately began to work on vital congregations, not as if that is the end and all of everything that we're supposed to do as United Methodists, but if disciples are made in congregations, then in fact we need more vital congregations. Therefore, our proximate outcome to get to the aspiration of making disciples and changing the world that we are called to, we first have to work on vital congregations. And so we've learned a lot about that there are basic practices of vital congregations that you need to be aware of and that you need to work on. And if you look at that list, you have a number of the proximate outcomes, not all of them, but you have a number of the proximate outcomes that here in the Texas Conference you have identified as worthy of your work to get you closer to making disciples. And for goodness sakes, I hope you recognize these because they came off your website. This is you, vital congregations. This is you giving your numbers for dashboards and metrics. Now, we do know that when you look at your dashboards and your metrics, you are offering numbers that are not the most sensitive in this culture. You're still asking how many members do you have at a time when people aren't joining congregations. You're still asking for average attendance in worship at a time in which attendance at worship often can be a program option for a new generation of people who don't come in through worship, through the portal of worship in the same way that their parents and their grandparents did. So the numbers that you're being asked are not always sensitive, but might I suggest they are necessary. You need to know, your district superintendents need to know, your bishop needs to know how strong you are and what resources you have to work with in order to continue to take next steps. They may not reflect all that you do in ministry, but you cannot not do dashboards and metrics. And you've been doing Vibrant Church Initiative, you've been doing church plantings, you've been doing emerging, yeah. I always try to tell people, for goodness sake, try to pay attention to what I'm thinking, not to what I'm saying. For the Emerging Leaders Initiative, the Advanced Pastoral Leadership, and already you are getting results. Already you can demonstrate through some research that's been done here in the Texas Conference that as you have been calling and supporting your younger leaders, that in fact the average age of their congregations are going down. We are learning how to talk to the next generation. I've always been fascinated by the conviction of Dorothy Bass in her work that she said, the purpose of a congregation is to pass the faith, to bear the faith on to the next generation. And there's evidence that in the Texas Conference you're learning how to do that. So now, before this sounds a little too upbeat and too Pollyannish, this conversation that I've been sharing with you is simply a conversation that I've been in with so many of our leaders and with so many of you. But let me also say that not everybody is in it. I want to talk about the 80-20%. Some of you will recognize this as the Pareto principle. Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, somewhere around the 1890s, came up with a rule of thumb that simply suggested that 80% of all that you will accomplish will be done by 20% of the people who are involved. Think about your church. 80% of the money that is given comes from about 20% of the people who are involved in your church. Fair enough? Do you also recognize that about 80% of the problems that you face come from about 20% of the people that you do ministry with? For whatever reason, and there is an economic reason behind this, I mean, economic in terms of the reasons of the tools of an economist, this seems to be a pattern that plays itself out really reasonably. And so we know that as we move ahead, most of the disciples that we will be making as United Methodists into the future will be made with a smaller number of our congregations. And in fact, a number of your congregations are either placed by size or by location to be culturally more comfortable with this culture than others are, and so they will have a more natural affinity for being able to make disciples, for being able to change their communities. We know that. We also know that there's going to be about 20% of us. That's an inclusive term that goes well beyond the Texas Conference. About 20% of us that will not make it because they are recalcitrant. That a number of our clergy, our lay people, our congregations will find the transition into this new world too burdensome and too difficult to want to take it on. Friends, as a consultant who has worked with congregations with 35 years, may I suggest that I have worked with a good number of people who are recalcitrant and proud of it, and will not stand with us as we find our way in this new land. If we talk about congregations that are trying to make disciples without practicing discipleship, one of the things that I learned from doing as much conflict work as I've done over the past years is that there are some congregations that are contentious because they love contention. I was with a congregation, let's call them UCC this time. And before I knew it, we were sitting around a round table, and the people were actually standing up, yelling full voice and pointing at each other, and I couldn't stop them until finally I slammed my hand down, told everybody to sit down and breathe slowly for 60 seconds, no talking. And the man next to me went, they were in it for the sport. Friends, if we cannot practice basic civility as the baseline of discipleship, we will not be part of the fruitful side of the church. And let's also recognize the fact that we have a number of congregations across our whole connection, including in the Texas Conference, that are simply those who have slipped below the threshold of change. They will not be able to step up and welcome new people. They will not be able to offer themselves and their worship in new ways. Perhaps they're too old, too weak. So not everybody's going to make it. But this too has been part of our learning. This too has been part of our learning that as a connectional church, the definition of connection is no longer tenure. We are no longer asking who of you have been United Methodist for the longest. We are no longer asking which of your congregations have been United Methodist for the longest. We are now asking questions of readiness. How many of you are ready to be the voice of Wesleyan Methodism in a new frontier? Are you ready to learn those new things? Are you ready to step forward? So we're looking now not for tenure and organizational faithfulness. What we're looking for is readiness. What we're looking for is fruitfulness. Are you brave enough to try something new that meets the needs of the world around you? Part of what we've learned over this 50 years is that for all of us, the game has changed. So that by the time we come to 2015, I can very convincingly say that as someone who is both a part of our United Methodist Church and deeply an observer and a conversation partner with our United Methodist Church, that if we are not winning, we are no longer losing. Friends, it isn't only about net membership at the end of the year. that there are multiple places that I can point, that you can point, in which the strength is already bubbling up from those who are ready and for those who want to be part of this Wesleyan voice in the foreign land. Conferences across our connection are stabilizing. Some are even growing. One of the things that we know is that new church starts are up over these past few years. The percentage of vital congregations that we have in our connection is growing. The number of bright spots, those places that are doing ministry that the communities and the culture around them are responding to. You know those stories because a lot of those bright spots are here in the Texas Conference. Yeah. Now, friends, and I'm kidding that when I tell the disaster stories, I tell about Presbyterians and UCCs. When I talk about the bright spots, I'm not infrequently talking about the Texas Conference. We do know that this growth has been happening within us. We do know, and we can point to, and we can name now a growing cohort of bolder, more courageous leaders. The bishops of the South Central jurisdiction clearly fit that category in a way that they did not do just a few quadrenniums ago. The district superintendents are now learning a boldness that we have not seen before. The people that we know and that we meet in the Texas Methodist Foundation clergy development groups, we're watching people gather their courage so that things can be different. And we now know that we have a growing cohort of missional leaders. We do know that after 50 years since Sam, the Sham, and the Pharaohs, we are beginning to be a new people in a new land. So, what can we say about the next steps that we have to take in the wilderness? And what this suggests is that there is still some learning for us to do. Might I suggest that for all of the good work that we have done, and I hope that as I've rehearsed this history, I'm rehearsing things that you remember, because you have been part of this. But for all of this work that we've been doing, all of this good work leading to health, growth, and bright spots, might I suggest that for the most part, wherever I go, the United Methodist denomination is still simply working in our own sweet spot. We have still found the place that we are most comfortable, and we are working it harder and harder. We are still a predominantly Anglo denomination, talking predominantly with Anglo people. We are still predominantly a middle-class people, wanting to talk with middle-class people. We are still fundamentally a middle-aged group, wanting to talk with people who are middle-aged. Why else would I bring up Sam, the Sham, and the Pharaohs? That's our sweet spot. That's our sweet spot. Might I also say that demographically, it is the fastest shrinking spot in the changing face of our mission field. How we doing? Now we're back to our two stories. Because you see, when I grew up, as far as I knew, there was no one in my church who had been arrested. And had they been, they would not have shared it with others. And can I say also that when I think about going to church, I don't think about going down to the skateboard park. But yet both of those stories were stories of the church, of the Wesleyan church, living far outside of our sweet spot. Do you hear it? This is the challenge that we have now. for the people who are going to rise and be part of the 20% that are going to do 80% of our disciple making, this is the part that we need to go at again. And so we have to ask our question even once again. And the question that we have to ask ourselves again has to do with the issue of, are we to live now only in what we already know? Are we only going to operate out of our sweet spot? One of the things that was always helpful for me, and Walter Brueggemann has been one of those places that has anchored not just my understanding, but my faith as well. And one of the things that he has talked about at great length is the fact that every time the Israelites had to go into the wilderness, whether it was the Exodus, whether it was the exile, at any time that they had to go into the wilderness in which their known ways were taken away from them, they had to ask the two questions again. How will we now be with God? And how will we now be with one another? Friends, I think that the question that's facing the Texas Conference, that's facing the United Methodist Church, isn't whether or not you're simply improving, but now how will you be with one another now that the mission field has changed? How will you now be with God when God doesn't do all of God's ministry through organized local congregations? Do you hear that? For us to think that we are going to invite more and more people from a population that has already decided that they are not attracted to organized religion, do you realize how tired you can get, how exhausted you can get by getting better and better at organized religion to try to address people who have already decided they don't like it? No, how will we now be with one another? What will the Wesleyan movement look like in the future? So in order to talk about the future, let's go back to one of our earliest beginnings, the book of Acts. And I'm going to ask you in this part, and this is where we're going to end up this afternoon, friends. I'm going to ask you where your congregation lives and where you believe your congregation needs to live. Here's a verse that's very familiar to you. It's a post-resurrection story. The disciples are talking to Jesus in their last conversation. They're asking Jesus, when is the time in which Israel will come back to its strength? And Jesus responds by saying, it is not for you to know the time, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Do you remember that one? And the group says, yes. Come on, friends. This is us. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the world. April, if I can have the next slide, please. I'd like us to locate ourselves. That passage offers us a gift to talk about ourselves and to talk about where we live. Because you see, when we're talking about Jerusalem, we're talking about us. Jerusalem are the people that we already know. These are the people we already talk to. We know their names. We can even tell their moods. We can even tell stories about them, especially when their backs are turned. We know these people a lot. And when you are in Jerusalem, this is the church talking to itself, the folk who already come. When you gather in annual conference, this is Jerusalem. You come here because you already know the people. You come here because there is comfort in being with people who are like you. You come because you are understood by people whom you understand. How are we doing? Does this make sense? Friends, one of the things I know is a lot of congregations I have been to do not want to talk to anybody except Jerusalem. Except the people they already know. But the passage goes on, not just Jerusalem, but to Judea. And Judea, if you will, is the area of sameness. Now, the area of sameness is not the same as us, but it's people like us. It's people who are familiar to us. We don't know their names, we don't recognize their faces, but obviously they are enough like us that we can be comfortable with them and we don't mind welcoming them. We might even say hello during the passing of the peace. But we're comfortable with these people. And so we have been practicing hospitality to reach out to Judea. How are we doing? Does it make sense so far? But Samaria is different. Samaria is dangerous. Samaria is uncomfortable. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to head north, it would be much better if you crossed over the Jordan, went around, and then came back in the Jordan in the north rather than walk through Samaria. Do you remember that part? Because these people are different. These people get arrested. These people skateboard. These people wear tattoos. These people are always telling us how they don't like organized religion and then go off to a small, very intimate, intense group for worship and for mission. And we can't figure it out. How are we doing? We okay so far? Friends, we have been doing a tremendous amount of work over the past 50 years learning how to be not just better Jerusalemites, but we have learned how to reach out in Judea. The next step that we have to begin to talk about is living in a foreign land. How will we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And that means being willing either to step out into Samaria or to support those who are willing to risk doing so. We will not all have the capacity. I mean, friends, look at me. I'm a bald, middle-aged man. I'm white, Anglo, and I don't dance. Am I truly the best conduit the Wesleyan Methodism has for this new world? No. But friends, you got to know that when I find the conduits who can do it because of my faith, I will get behind them and I will support them and I will push as hard as I can. So, the question I'd like you to take after all of this is, where is your congregation willing to live? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. Now, friends, if we are living in Jerusalem and only in Jerusalem, then our conversations are going to be about survival. Because we are already living off of more and more money given by fewer and fewer people who are getting older and older, and if they are the only ones we are willing to talk to, then this is what I would call a short-term strategy. I've told a number of friends, one of my favorite conversations I had in a conflict conversation quite some time ago outside of Chicago was this older gentleman in the middle of worship wars came up to me and said, "Gil, I don't understand. Why don't we just sing one of the 20 approved hymns?" He was a good man, and I enjoyed him. But he would not leave Jerusalem. Is that the conversation you want to have at home? Because you can have it just by talking with the people who are already there. Or is your congregation willing to live in Judea? Are you willing to improve what you already know how to do? And improving means getting better at what you know how to do with people who are like you. And this is where we come back to a lot of the efforts that you have been working on here in the Texas Conference, the vital congregations, the radical hospitality, trying to do creative worship that expands the possibility that people can connect with God through your worship. Are you willing to improve what you already know how to do so that you can pass it on to the new people who also feel called to faith through organized religion, through congregations? It's an improvement conversation. Or are you willing to step out into Judea or find those who will and get behind them? Now, your bishops and I are just starting the conversation about what it means to be in Judea, and this will not be an easy trip. Because you see, you can't live in Judea under the same rules as Jerusalem and Samaria. And I don't know if you've noticed, but the United Methodist Church likes rules. So this will be difficult. But this means learning what we don't know how to do with people who are not like us. This means making friends with the arrested. This means supporting skateboarders. This means all of those other things that you already know because they're already happening. But what they need is the word of United Methodist behind them saying, God bless you for what you do. Where is your congregation willing to live? And what conversation do you need to have with your church when you go home? Friends, thank you.